There's a lot of different ways to approach St. Thomas, and one of them would be, is he really relevant to us today, or what's the point, or what can we learn from a person who died in 1274 AD, okay? But this conversation we're talking about, Don said a couple of things that tie right into it. One was something about us being wired that way. You know, we're wired to protect our families or whatever. So I want you to kind of hold that thought. The other thing I wanted to mention based on just the conversation is the words that people use and the way we think about things and our understanding of why we sometimes unconsciously believe what we believe really matters. And I'm going to talk about, real briefly, the two phrases pro-life and pro-choice. I don't like either one of those phrases. You can't really start a dialogue with anybody because the two are opposed, and they're an example of basically soundbite marketing. You're saying pro-life because we're wired such that that means, you know, that we're not pro-death. And so the other side is using the term pro-choice because they don't want to focus on life or death. They want a choice or anti-choice. Well, folks, who in here is not for life? And who in here isn't for freedom of choice? Okay? Nobody. Everybody's for life, and everybody's for freedom of choice. Because we have free will. That is a fact of our nature. So those two concepts set up an impossibility to have a dialogue. Okay? And soundbite thinking is not adequate to dealing with the pressures of Satan in our world today. I'll just put it that way. Okay? So, Thomas Aquinas. It's a little bit intimidating to know that this is volume 1 of the 5-part Summa Theologica, just one of his bodies of work. And that he wrote this as an introduction to theology for theology students. Okay. I was blessed with this by my wife for Christmas. And I talked to the professor at Ave Maria and said, I'd looked at some of this online, and frankly, it's a little dense. There's no pictures in this book. Let me ask this: how many people in here, and you know, I'm asking this as a serious question because I know what I've thought and rethought over the last 30 years. How many people in here feel like, you know, you can't really prove that God exists, so you just have to have faith that he exists? I mean, have you ever felt that? Okay. Well, there are different approaches to logical thought, and I'm going to just use math as an example. You can have a line of reasoning that is based on what you can observe and measure, and then you can have a line of reason that is based on what they call axioms or first principles. Geometry is an example of a hard math that starts with axioms, without which you can't go anywhere. They're not measured. These are thoughts, okay? These are things that people think through and set up these basic first principles. So like in geometry, if you're going to describe to somebody that you've got 3 lines, and each line is connected to 2 of the other lines, what do you have? You have a triangle. Can you get a circle from 3 straight lines connected to 2 of the other ones?
By definition,
No.
no.
By definition, no. Does geometry work? Yes. We're standing in a building that is a function of the principles of geometry. We ride on bridges that are functions of geometry, trigonometry, and calculus, and all of that. My point is, you cannot prove that axiom of geometry. It's because it's something called self-evident. Once you've defined it, that's what it is. Okay? This is why in math you don't have the conservative school of math and the liberal school of math. Okay? You don't have the people that are going, my dad told me 2 plus 2 is 4, and his dad told him 2 plus 2 is 4, and by God, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. And then on the other side going, you know, that's so dogmatic. You know, what if 2 plus 2 wanted to be 5? You know, isn't it fair? Shouldn't it go ahead and be 5? Or maybe 3, or 4.5? You want to drive on a bridge that's built with liberal math? I mean, seriously. These things matter. There's truth and there's not truth, and in math they can't get around that. Okay? So, what happens with St. Thomas, and the reason why he matters, that's right, I folded up the wrong piece of paper, the one I can't read. In 1874, I think it was, Pope Leo XIII basically elevated St. Thomas to the philosopher, theologian of the church. And he did that back then because he saw trends happening in thinking that he could basically tell were going to lead in a wrong direction. What St. Thomas did was take Aristotelian and Neoplatonic thought and fit it with Catholic theology. And here's why that matters. Around 1700, Descartes, everybody heard of Descartes? He took an approach to philosophy that was essentially, how do I know what I know is true? And he started really trying to think through how do you learn what you know? And what he determined was that sometimes his senses fooled him. Like you could pull a suit out of your closet and think it was a black suit, but then you could get into the light of the day and it's actually a navy blue suit. So your senses fooled you, so you can't depend on your senses. That's kind of where he started with. And then he thought through stuff like, you know, you could be taking a class and you could be certain you had the right answer on a test, be completely confident with it, and then be shocked to find out that your answer was wrong. And so you go through and you finally realize where your error was, and you realize that you were wrong, and now you're sure that you're right, but the sense that you have right now that you're sure you're right is the same sense that you had that you were sure you were right when you were wrong. So he was trying to think through how do we know anything's real. That's where he finally drilled down to that phrase everybody's probably heard of, I think, therefore I am. Now, in his mind, that was a good beginning, and from there he went on to prove the existence of God to satisfy where he was coming from. But fundamentally, what he did was he set up what modern philosophy has become today. Because if you really think about what he just went through, he determined that he was the center of the universe. That the universe was defined in terms of his thought. He rejected the idea that there are things that you can know and then work from those. You always have to start basically with yourself. Okay? That kind of thinking is what allows us to get to the point where the Girl Scouts are handing out healthy, happy, hot brochures from Planned Parenthood because they've disconnected themselves, frankly, from God. Because Plato, Aristotle, and then through them to Aquinas, they recognize that the world does exist. You are, therefore you think, is basically the way that I would rephrase that. there are things that you can know from the universe that can take you inexorably to God. Okay? So, Aquinas has 5 ways that he's listed in this book, and I'm not going to read them all because they're pretty tedious, but I'm going to give you an idea of what part of the problem is. He goes, on the contrary, to say in the person of God, I am who am. This is pure being, okay? So I answer that. The existence of God can be proved in 5 ways. The first and more manifest way is the argument from motion. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now whatever is in motion is put in motion by the... Okay, it's dense. You can't soundbite this, okay? But philosophers of today have soundbited this. They've taken what Aquinas put as a summary, as an introductory text to student theologians that presupposes an Aristotelian or classical philosophical worldview. And without that underpinning, you can't really understand these proofs. But if you understand the underpinning, you can understand these proofs. And folks, I'm just going to say that for me, I'm completely satisfied that you can prove the existence of God rationally. It follows automatically from the basic understandings, the basic principles, the axioms, if you will, just like geometry does. So it is rational, reasonable, it's scientific. Philosophy, we're learning in our classes, Domna, is a preamble to faith, because philosophy is how you look at what you know and how you know what you know. And what your philosophy is, everybody has a philosophy. We cobble it together as we go, or we deliberately construct it. Most of us have cobbled it together as we go because it's not taught in school. Okay? But the basic ideas that Aquinas has, that starting with a philosopher named Hume has been set aside, is the idea of cause and effect. Hume, if you read him, he sounds like he's psychotic, because he basically says, if I throw a rock through that window and it breaks, that is not cause and effect. Just because it has happened so far every time that I've done it, the simple reality is they're discrete events. There's a rock going through the air, and then there's a shattering glass. And they just have the appearance of cause and effect. This is what that man says, okay? So they've decoupled the whole idea of cause and effect, and very specifically, basically 4 causes that Aquinas talks about. They're formal cause, material cause, efficient cause, and final cause. What they're really getting rid of is final cause. Now, I don't know what his motivation is, but I could tell you what I would think the devil's motivation would be for pushing that idea. And that's because if there is no final cause, then it really doesn't matter, folks, what we do. It does not matter. But nobody lives that way in their real world. So, I bring forth the Lady of Guadalupe cigar matches. Some people might think this is sacrilegious. So, now, if I strike this match, what's going to happen? Is it going to burst into song?
No. Maybe.
Okay.
That's the
Yeah.
root.
Exactly. Maybe.
Right.
Hume's thought allows for that and says that that was just a happy accident. Okay? That's not true. This match was designed to do what I just did. If it did not light, you wouldn't go, oh well, you just never know about those things, would you? Or if I struck it and water gushed forth, would you go, yeah, I've seen that before? I mean, really? Would you?
No.
Why?
Illogical.
If it did gush forth water, would you just think to yourself, oh gosh, who knows what's going to happen next time? Or would you think to yourself, where did that water come from? What I'm trying to say is we think in terms of final causes. Formal cause, what is the form? Okay, a ball is what? Well, it's round, and it's made of rubber, generally. Okay? Material cause, that it's made of rubber. So the form is the shape. The material is what it's made of. The efficient cause, the factory that built it. The final cause, so a kid can bounce the ball. Okay? If you remove some of that along the way, you don't have a ball. If it's a square, it's not a ball. If it's made out of rock so that it doesn't bounce, it's not a ball. Okay? If it wasn't made in the first place, it's not a ball. And the whole reason all those other things happen is so a kid can bounce it. So this match could light. We think and are built such that we understand from our experience that there are final causes. And from that, you can work through and prove the existence of God. Because for a final cause to be, there has to be what he refers to as a first mover. It just doesn't happen otherwise. Okay? So, the reason I'm spending all this time talking about what philosophy and all that, as opposed to telling you long stories about Aquinas' life, is because you could go on and on and on. This topic is so big, you could give a saint talk on him every day of the week for probably the whole year. What the church recognized in him was that he was the best proponent of what they call classical philosophy or scholastic thought. And it is the antidote to our problems today. And that antidote is with every one of us. When people say things that are stupid, that we're able to identify why they're stupid. Saw a thing on a blog the other day. How can a person be pro-life and pro-death, meaning the death penalty? Okay. Well, you hear pro-life, pro-death, and you go, well, those are opposites. How can people be both? One or the other must be wrong. I mean, it sets up a whole series of, apparent conflicts. It's a fake question. Okay? The question need to be formulated like this. Just say first, how can somebody be pro-life? It's, okay, pro-life is really what? What it's really about, the question is really about, does the state, well, earlier than that, does a woman have the right to terminate a pregnancy? And if so, does the state have a right to regulate that? Pro-death. Does the state have a right to laws? And does it have a right to punish lawbreakers? And if so, at what level would that punishment rise to the point of capital punishment? I submit to you that there's nothing opposite about those questions. They're not related. Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, do you agree with that? That they are unrelated questions? The word life and death can be used in both of them, but fundamentally there are two different questions there. Does a woman have a right to terminate a pregnancy? Does the state have a right to kill a criminal? Those are not the same question. Okay? So it's a fake question. But you can't soundbite your way out of that. You have to do what I just did, which is define it concretely so that we're actually talking about what we're really talking about, not a bunch of airy-fairy baloney that's just kind of out there. Because like I said earlier, who's not pro-life? But that muddled thinking has brought us abortion, is bringing us euthanasia, okay? It brings us, and I don't want to be political, but I listened in passing as I was studying, I'd go back and forth, and I heard Obama's State of the Union. And my sister, who is a liberal, new age, something or other, who believes that Obama is the most intelligent man ever conceived, I said, I started laughing, and I said, is it wrong to characterize a speech of the President of the United States as vapid? And she goes, what do you mean? And I said, well, so far I've heard, it's not my fault. That was the first part of his speech. And then he was saying something about immigration to the effect of, give me a law that fixes everything and makes everything wonderful, and I'll enact it tomorrow. Well, no shit. That's like saying, give me the cure to cancer and I'll provide it to people. Well, of course you would. I mean, seriously, that's a speech. That's the State of the Union. You give me the answer and I'll use it? Duh. I'm sorry, but that's stupid. That's a vapid comment. It's meaningless. There is no president or anybody else that would say, give me the perfect answer and I'll just shelve it for now. Nobody's going to do that. And people sit there going, okay? We need to be engaged. From this understanding of the nature of reality, God is self-evident, like an axiom in geometry. And from that, you get to Jesus as required, as part of the plan, okay? And then we come to Joe Catholic. And it's, none of it's an accident. Okay? Now, I will say that I started to read some of this, and I talked to Professor Bushman, and I asked him for a book. I said, look, I'm assuming you don't pick up the Summa Theologica and you just read it like a novel. He said, no, it's more of a reference. He said, I suggest a first glance at St. Thomas, a handbook for peeping Thomists, okay, by Father Ralph McInerney. And I went to read this, and I realized that I did not have the underlying vocabulary or the understanding of philosophy to even really follow this. And then I ran across this guy, Edward Feser. Edward Feser is a professor of philosophy in University, I think, in California, who was an atheist, and through St. Thomas Aquinas and his study became a Catholic. And so I bought this. This is a little bit of work too, but my example of the rubber ball and all that, and an example that was in here that brought me to these matches, this is helping me to understand things that you know. You'll read stuff in here and you'll think, well, that's why I believe that. I didn't really know why I believe that, but that's why I believe that. And it's because it's the truth. So, in 1874, Pope Leo XIII knew that philosophical thought had taken a wrong turn, and he decreed, basically, that Thomas Aquinas was our compass. So that's why he matters. That's why it's important. It's probably more critical today than it's ever been. So I encourage everybody to become familiar with him and really grasp why you believe what you believe. There's nothing mystical about it, except that everything's mystical. But it's rational, it's true, it's understandable. You can approach it. So my big push is to say, you can prove that God exists. In fact, it's shockingly obvious if you understand the axioms. It gives one pause to think that they don't teach this in school anymore. It's almost like it's a plot. Let's not teach people how to think, because they're much easier to manage that way. It's our duty to have free will and not be afraid to use it. Thank you. Yes?
When my father was a student at a little French school in northern Indiana,